So I have a saying on my corkboard on my desk that says, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. And you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. And I think that tells us about our story of Bartimaeus today, that it's all about freedom. This guy won't shut up, even though people tell him to. And that's hard. It's hard to keep speaking up when you have felt like an outcast or you have felt less than. We can be quick to fall into silence in general, worried about offending or hurting feelings or even being rejected. And so when people tell us to be quiet, often we're all too ready to oblige. But Bartimaeus won't, because he is free. He is free to call for help, free to make his needs known. Perhaps it's because he suffered enough, or that he feels like he has nothing left to lose, or he just doesn't care anymore. Or perhaps he senses or really sees that when you turn to God, all the rules change, and you are no longer blind Bartimaeus, but instead Bartimaeus, a beloved child of God. Whatever the reason, he knows that he is free, and he seizes his faith and his courage to live into that freedom. And he is made well. It's all about freedom. And I think for people that go back and read that story, it's really easy to criticize the disciples for their inability to see the things that were being taught to them. But the things that they were being shown aren't easy to see. Suffering, betrayal, death. What might any of us do if our beloved teacher told us and showed us these things? Some things feel just too hard to grasp, and sometimes seeing isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And I think that's especially true in our life of faith. It's much easier to focus only on the happy parts, that God's love is for everyone, and God's desire is for our well-being, and that hope that we find in God. But faith doesn't always involve just those happy parts. I think a mature faith also engages the hard things, those things like suffering and betrayal, death, poverty, addiction, domestic violence, all those lists that we could come up with. All faith looks on the happy parts of life, but a mature faith dares to look at the hard parts too. And I think that this is true for recovery, because recovery isn't a guarantee that the hard parts of life won't happen. But what it does do is it gives us the tools and the resources to use to move through those times. And as Danny was sharing earlier about 22 years plus, I have seen him show that and model that over and over again, that when the hard times come, he relies on those people in his life and he relies on this program to move through those times. But really seeing the hard parts of life takes a price. When we see the world's brokenness, we lose some of our own innocence. When we see the world's brokenness, we suffer. And when we see the world's brokenness, we feel compelled to change our lives. And this is where our faith and recovery help us determine what that change will look like. Because without them, it's easy for that change to become isolation, depression, hopelessness, and addiction. Author Nora Gallagher puts it this way: I remember thinking as I worked in a soup kitchen that I didn't want to know what I was learning, because then my life couldn't go on in the same way. Driving around in my nice car and thinking about what new linens I was going to buy. What we learn, we cannot unlearn, and what we see, we cannot unsee. And any of us that have spent time under the bridge, serving meals and making sure people have groceries and clothes, or have spent time helping at the rescue mission, know that you can't unsee what you have seen. But you can take that moment to have a heart of serving God's people and at the same time being grateful for what you have in your own life. And for anyone in here that has relapsed, you know that you can't unlearn what you have learned or unsee what you have seen, which often makes a relapse more difficult than the time of using because you remember those things that you were taught and experienced in recovery. So it's easy for us to criticize the disciples for not seeing what they were being shown. And maybe what they're not seeing or wanting to see was a way of protecting themselves. It was a defense. Because maybe deep down, they knew that once they really saw what was around them, the people around them, like Bartimaeus, they wouldn't be able to unsee it again. Once they got what their teacher was saying about the reality of the world, their lives were going to have to change. And once they got that following God would lead them to see, and in some cases even experience suffering, betrayal, and death, that their rose-colored glasses of faith would no longer sustain them. Maybe the disciples avoided seeing what was around them because deep down they knew that seeing can be dangerous. In the beginning, addiction often provides a false sense of coping with the world. It masks and blinds the reality of what is happening in our lives, but that doesn't last. The reality of the world continues to build and build and build. And addiction eventually is revealed as a false teacher, a false guide on how to move through this world. A big part of having faith in God and being able to trust God and work this program is being willing to see things as they really are. But if seeing is important to the life of faith and also has the potential to turn our lives upside down, what do we do? Do we keep our hearts open but our eyes closed? Do we keep our eyes open but our hearts closed? And is there some way, as a person of faith, to keep both our eyes and our hearts open? And I guess in asking that, it's how do we survive seeing? Well, here's how Bartimaeus survived, and it is found in his freedom. He started with believing that God thought more of him than as a second-class citizen. He believed that God was a God of mercy and could heal him. And before Bartimaeus looks at anything, God becomes the context for everything that he will see. And after his healing, Bartimaeus believed that after his healing, Bartimaeus won't see anything without thinking of the one who healed him. Bartimaeus believed that God can invite people into leaving their bondage behind, their bondage of addiction, and claim the abundant life and freedom that God offers. That is the truth that set Bartimaeus free. That God has already made you free through grace and through love and has called you a beloved child. It is the past that often traps us. The past that reminds us of all of our shortcomings and our failures and our disappointments. But the God that was the God of Israel, that told through the prophet Jeremiah that even though Israel forgot their identity and fell short in 100 different ways, God would not hold this against them. That God will, and indeed already has, willfully forgiven and wiped away all those ways that they fell short. God gives freedom, and we hear the same idea that is echoed in the 9th step promise. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. Because with God and relying on God as we work the steps, there is freedom. Freedom from the bondage of addiction, freedom from the bondage of the past, and freedom from any of the ways that you have felt that you were less than or unworthy. Now, God's grace and God's love is hard to fully embrace because it has been freely given to us, so it's hard to believe, especially when you're in that place of feeling less than. It's hard because it goes against so many of the other ways that we've been taught. Because we don't need to do anything or earn anything, say anything or accomplish anything or buy anything to earn God's love and God's grace. We already have it. But I think most of the world's problems and most of our own problems start when we forget that we already have love and we already have worth and dignity as a gift from God. And instead, we try to earn it or we try to take it from someone else. Bartimaeus teaches us that we aren't trapped by our current circumstances and we aren't trapped by our past. No matter what we may have done and no matter what may have been done to us, none of these things define us. We are free because we have God's love. I know that this is something that can be really, really hard, especially in early recovery, to believe and to feel and to experience. Because some of what has happened seems so huge and so important and so all-encompassing. And it's not to say that these things don't matter. They do. Illness, disappointment, hurt, addiction, whatever it may be. They matter. And they may in fact be descriptively true of us, but they do not define us. And I want to make sure that we hear that because it's so important. Our past, our hurts, even our successes may be descriptively true of us, but they do not define us. Nothing we have done and nothing that has been done to us captures who we are completely. Only one thing can do that. God. However you understand God. And God has chosen to call us God's beloved children. And each and every one of us is precious to God and loved. That's what defines us. Being loved by God. And so with God and with this program, we are free. We are free to work these steps, free to embrace these spiritual principles, and to define and embrace the God of your own understanding. And we are free to risk and to serve and help and care and try and struggle and laugh and all the rest. We are free. We are free to love God just as God loves us. And we are also free to receive that love. Free from the bondage of addiction and all those messages of less than and all those messages of unworthiness. This program teaches through the 12 steps that you are free. Free from the past, free from regret, from fear, from self-limitation, and from old hurts and mistakes. And you probably won't believe it the first time you hear it, and maybe not even the 100th time that you hear it. But keep showing up. Keep working the steps and keep building that relationship with the God of your understanding. Because this freedom takes some practice. Sometimes the world and always addiction will often try to convince you otherwise. So the freedom that sets you free, it takes a little while to sink in. So today, in this moment, let us follow the example of Bartimaeus and trust that God's love for us is greater than whatever our present circumstances may be. And let us learn to believe that God's love extends to the whole world, to every person and in every situation. And let us learn to recognize that God is everywhere, present and working with all of creation for its redemption and its transformation. And may God help us to see God with open eyes and open hearts. May God help us to see the broken places and to see how God is actively working to heal those places. Amen.